Good Erev Shabbos, everybody. Welcome back once again to the weekly shir in Pirkei Avos. Rabbi Gershon Afson here in Cincinnati, Ohio. This week we are going to be learning Perek Dalet, the fourth Perek in the cycle of Limud of Pirkei Avos and Tavshin Pei, and we are going to be learning the second half of Mishnah Ches. There are different girsois as to how the Perek is set up, but we are going to be learning the second half of Mishnah Ches. This Mishnah really is a continuation of tremendous lessons and teachings of the great legendary Tana, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is one of the most oft-quoted Tanoim in the Mishnayos, and he had 5 sons. He called them his 5 cedar trees that he planted for the Eibishter. The greatest of them was Rabbi Shmuel. He is spoken in extremely high reverence in the Gemara, and Rabbi Shmuel speaks very strongly to Dayanim. He himself was a big Dayan, and he was especially fluent in the teachings of his father and the Pirkei Dinim of his father, Rabbi Yossi, and he was a very, very relied upon source. And in the Mishnayos, Zayin Ches, he gives us certain lessons for judges. For example, in Mishnah Zayin, he tells us not to be a gas ruach, balgaiva, that really affects our capacity to judge impartially. Also, he says not to be don yechidi. You're not allowed to judge alone. Now, there's an interesting story. There was once a Chassidish Rebbe. Now, the Polish Chassidim, they don't say the way they pronounce the shuruk, the u sound is e. When we would say Yehudi, they would say Yehidi. That's the way they talk. And one of the Chassidim overheard someone saying, instead of saying al don Yehidi, don't be don Yehidi ela echad, he said al ti don Yehidi, which means don't judge a yid. And he told it over to the Chassidish Rebbe, and he was very excited about this vort. Don't be don yechidi. Don't allow yourself to judge in a single way. You should have only the Eibishter judges alone. And the reason why this is a chidush, why do we need the Mishnayos to teach this? The Bartanura explains that in halacha, there is a concept called a yochid mumche, which means somebody that's an expert in a certain field. He's a yochid mumche, and because he is a yochid mumche, he has the ability to halachically paskin by himself. And nevertheless, we say, even though halachically you're allowed to paskin by yourself, we're asking you to go lifnim mishura sadin midarkei achasidus. And midarkei achasidus, it's always best not to do things on your own, even if you have the authority to do so. We know what the Gemara tells us in Tainis, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Amar Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak, Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Lama nimshlu divrei Torah ke'etz. Why is Torah called a tree? Like we say, Eitz Chayim Hila Machazikim Ba. Why is it called a tree? Loi Malach, it's coming to tell you, Ma Eitz Kotan Madlich es Hagadol. The same way when you have a big tree, the way you light it up is you take a small branch, you light it, and use that to ignite and to light up the larger pieces of wood. So too, the smaller the Talmidim, they may be less intelligent, less bright, or less learned, less fluent, but by teaching Talmidim and conversing with people, even if they are not on your level, it makes you smarter, makes you have the ability to actually come out with a better product. And the Gemara says, Hainu da Amar Reb Chanina. This is what Reb Chanina says, Harbe lamati miraboisai. I learned a lot from my teachers. By learning bechavrusa with my friends and discussing the sugya, I actually learned more than even from my teachers. But from teaching my students and them challenging and asking and really pushing me through to verify and to really back up my thoughts and logic, that gave me the most knowledge. So therefore, the Tana is turning to this Yid, who's a big Choshva Yid. He's a Mumcha. And we're asking him, please, 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 even though you are a Mumcha, refrain from teaching and paskening on your own. Now, there is actually an interesting halachic discussion that the Bartanuda brings up, and it's challenged, and it's discussed, and it's analyzed by the Gedolei HaPoskim. And that is when the Mishnah tells us that a judge should not paskin on his own, even if he is an expert. Is that din apply if the people on their own acknowledge and they were mekabel this Rav to be their poisik? Meaning, let's say the Rav was sitting in shul, he was sitting in the Beis Din, and two people said, we know that so it's better to have three, but we are mekabel on ourselves, your psak, as an individual Rav, as a poisik, as a mumcha. When that happens, when it's coming from the people themselves, does the Rav have to say, no, I'd rather have three? The Mishnah says, Alti don yechidi, don't judge on your own. Or is that din of the Mishnah only apply in a case where there is no request, but sometimes you have the authority even if you don't have the request? So that is the question. So the Bartanura says, Avol kiblu bali adin aleim, if the people, the litigants, accepted upon themselves the authority of the Rav, Don Yechidi, he's allowed to paskin on his own. Vafilu b'derech hachasidus. Even according to Lifnim Mishuras Hadin, there is no problem with paskening on your own. However, this is challenged by the Poiskim. There is the other Mefarshim that they say no, that in no case, the Mashal says, in no way should any Rav who wants to follow Midas HaChasidus paskin on his own. Other Mefarshim challenge it. They challenge it from a Gemara in Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells us a story. This is in Talmud Yerushalmi, Sanhedrin, Perek Aleph, first chapter of Sanhedrin. The Gemara says that Rabbi Avos was sitting in shul, and people came and they wanted him to rule. And his Talmidim said, how did you accept upon yourself to rule? We have a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, Alti don yechidi, don't judge on your own. And he said, that's only for me to go out and impose my rulings. However, if they accepted upon themselves and they requested it and they understood that a single person has limited knowledge, logic, and understanding, and they still accepted it, nevertheless, it's no problem. So we see clearly from this Gemara, seemingly, that it isn't an issue. And the Shach, the Sifsei Kohen on Shulchan Aruch, which is these halachas are discussed in Siman Gimel of Hilchas Choshen Mishpat, of Hilchas Sanhedrin, Dayanim. So the Shach writes that while it's true that in the times of the Gemara and the Rishonim, the mumche, the expert, who was requested to rule, it was no problem for him to rule without getting a quorum, without getting two others. He says nowadays, Galus, where there's no one as a real expert like a Bavo, it's still best to always have three. And if you're going to paskin alone, make it very clear to them that how limited a single person is in our days in their knowledge and their scope of halacha. You have to be very clear to the litigants that you're going to get a psak that might be limited in its scope because you're not discussing it with other people. But regardless, we see clearly there's the concept of alti don yechidi. We don't judge alone. Or like I saw Rabbi Bogomilsky brings down in the Sefer of Dibarta Bum, I think it's from the Amshinov Rebbe, but I'm not sure. And he says that Don Yechidi also means looking at a person alone. Whenever you have to think of punishing a Yid, whatever the situation is, remember that this person's children, grandchildren, it can have an effect of generations before you expel a kid from school, whatever is needed to be done. Don't alti don yechidi. Don't look at him as an individual person. Realize that you don't understand the generations that come after that person. A positive effect can have ripples and ripples. Children, unfortunately, a small comment in a negative way can turn off a child, a boy, a girl, and that can affect generations to come. Sometimes you go back and you find out that it was a small little incident, a small smirk, a small comment, a misjudgment, or a punishment that the child felt was unjust, and that turned them off from the way of Torah v'mitzvahs. So make sure we are not don yechidi, make sure we are not looking just at the person, we're looking at the entire scope and the entire generations that come from this person. But now let's talk about the second half of the Mishnah. And I want to say that I prepared a longer shiur. Today it's going to be a little bit of abridged because of the constraints of time. The second part of the Mishnah, he says, Al toimer kablu daiti. Don't say that you must accept my das, my opinion. Why? Shehein rashoyin, they are allowed to, v'loy ata, and not you. So who is this referring to? Who's Rabbi Shmuel talking to? What is the context of this halacha? So most mefarshim explain that this is a continuation of the previous point. And that is, we're talking about a yochid mumche. We're talking about somebody that halachically can rule on his own. Now, what happens if this person who could rule on his own, we told him in the last part of the Mishnah that it's still better to get other people part of the Beis Din, even if they have less of a knowledge of the subject, they're not as an expert as you are, because you're able to get insight from other people. What happens after the court case, after the Din Torah? They come into the Cheder HaRabbonim, they come to the room, chambers, the Paskin, and Lepoil, he has one opinion, and he's the expert, and the two other people that he brought just to help him really get to his reasoning, they want to rule in favor of the other person. And he's sitting there and he's like, wait a minute, I only brought you guys on really to help me get to my reason. It would be very strange if comes out that we're going to rule like you over me, and I have really deep down the sole authority to rule on my own. So what's going on over here? So instead, he tries to tell the other Dayanim, Kablu Daiti, don't forget that I am the expert here. Don't forget that I have the das. I have my opinion is the real opinion that matters. And please, even though you differ, you should rule and live like I paskin, because I was the main authority to begin with. So the Mishnah says, no, it doesn't work that way. Even though there are cases, and it's interesting, according to some of the mefarshim, which I don't want to get into at great length, if you have a few chachamim that hold a certain way, and a few chachamim that don't hold that way, but the minority is much brighter than the majority. So there are some opinions that say that the minority in that case becomes the majority, that they can, so to speak, go over the achrei rabim lahatos. That we follow the majority is when they're really on the same level. But when their minority is so much brighter, not an individual. The Gemara says about the mayor that he was an individual that was so bright and he was brilliant and no one could really understand him. So the ruling was not like him. Or like the famous story of Rebbe Elazar ben Horkinus, that even Beis Din Shalmaila, they said that the oven it should rule like the Rebbe Elazar ben Horkinus. But we said, Ein mashkichim bebaskel, we don't listen to a baskel. And regardless, we disassociate the psak of an individual person when he's arguing with the roi, when he's arguing with the plural, with the majority. However, if the minority is a brilliant minority, and there's a few of them, according to some opinions, you are allowed to follow the minority opinion. But besides that, the simple understanding of the Mishnah is that the Tana is teaching us that this person who's the Yochid Mumche should not overextend his personality, his authority, to coerce the other people to come to his ruling. Because if he does that, in essence, he's a Don Yechidi. If he's not going to give them a real opinion, he's not going to take their psak seriously, and he's only going to follow his psak anyways. So then it's not mitalmida yoiser mikulam. You convince them. Go try to convince them. Heim rashoim. They could say, "Let me hear your svar again." They could be convinced by the brilliant judge, but they can't be forced, because if not, then you're in essence you're a don yechidi with a paper stamped, rubber stamped Beis Din, which is not the way it should be. And obviously, the Mefarshim say that this is not just in regards to a dayan, but that is in any interaction we have with people. The Mishnah is teaching us that even if you have the authority to push your way through, and you have the authority to push your weight on a certain issue, al pi midas hachasidus, you don't want people following you because they are forced to. You don't want your opinion to be held over people's heads. You want it to be accepted by the people which are in front of you, your colleagues, your community. It has to be an accepted way. Now, I want to share with you a brilliant thought that was written, and I found it in a sefer called the Magen Avos. There are two svarim, Magen Avos and Pirkei Avos, possibly more. This I saw a very, very beautiful vart, and it's in the Mekoros, in the sources as well. And he writes as following: that every single yid wants to do what the Eibishter wants. That's his neshama. Wants to do what Hashem wants. And most of us, it's not just our neshama. If you woke us up and you asked us, Nu, Yankel, Beryl, Chaya, Chana, would you love to do what Hashem wants? Answer is yes. That's what you really want. Not just conceptually, you actually want it. But we have a Yetzer Hara, and we have a Yetzer Toiv, and sometimes we don't feel like we are really in control. And when we fail, and many of us do very often, we seem to blame the Eibishter. We say it's not our fault. Hashem gave us Yetzer Hara, and we're not in control of ourselves. So what happens is that the neshama comes l'mayla after 120 years, and they start calculating the ma'asim tovim, the positive things, and the things which sorech shipur, that demand a certain, things that have to be rectified. And at this stage, it's the bottom line that counts. As they say in heaven, they don't take checks, they only take receipts. So it's the bottom line that counts. And it's not looking good for our friend Rabbi Yankel. So Rabbi Yankel turns and he says, it's not my fault, it's the Eibishter's fault. He gave me the Yetzer Hara. So in essence, he's putting Hashem on trial. So the Tana, according to the Magen Avos, the Tana is telling this person, Beremez at least, Alti don yechidi, don't judge the Eibishter. The Eibishter self-judges. You cannot put the blame of the Yetzer Hara on the Eibishter. The Eibishter gave you the koiches, the Eibishter gave you Yetzer Hara, he gave you the ability to deal with whatever challenges you have. And it's not right to shift the blame to the Eibishter. So he says, fine, I won't blame the Eibishter, but I want Beis Din Shel Maila to look at my das, that really the whole time I really wanted to do right. There is a famous expression, I'm not going to be so articulate in English, but which goes and says that the path to Gehenna is paved with good intentions. People want to do good. But we tell the Beis Din, kablu daiti. Don't look at my actions. Look at my inner desire, my das, that I really wanted to serve the Eibishter. So the Tana says, no, 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 no. Because we feel that we're going to say that and say that we weren't in control. We weren't given the ability to control our Yetzer Hara. And the Tana says, no, 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 you're not going to get away with that. Al Tamer Adam Kabel Daiti. It's not going to work for you. The Eibishter gave you the ability to be in charge, to control your Nefesh Bahamis. And if you don't, and if we don't, that's on our, it's on our cheshbon. And your good intentions and your das that you're going to and you wanted to and you really worked hard to, that's not going to make it for you when the time of din happens. Which is important as we get ready for the cheshbon nefesh of Chodesh Elul, that we understand that we can't shift the blame on anyone else, not even to the Eibishter. We can't shift the blame on saying how well-intentioned we were. It's the bottom line that really counts. And I want to share this final thought of this abridged shir today, but I think it's very profound. And that is that for years and years and years, the responsibility of bringing Mashiach and bringing the Geula was done and was felt by the leaders of the generation. The Nasi Adar, his job was to wage war to bring Mashiach. And at a certain point, the Nasi Adar, our Rebbe, said, Alti dan yechidi. This avodah I'm not doing on my own. For Mashiach to come, I have to give it to each and every one of you. Because ein dan yechidi ela echad. Only the Eibishter does things on his own. This Geula of Klal Yisrael can't be done by one person. The Geula of Klal Yisrael has to come from Klal Yisrael itself, has to be their Geula. And not only is it our job and our responsibility to bring Mashiach, but the Rebbe also gave us a very interesting way how to do it. And that is, Al Toimer Adam Kablu Daiti. Our job is not to go and tell people, you should know Mashiach is here. You don't understand it? Just accept what I tell you. I'm telling you reality, Mashiach is here. No, that's obviously a step. But the Rebbe said that Mashiach has to be taught Bo'efen HaMiskabel. You have to know your crowd. You have to know who you're catering for and how you're going to make the subject that you're teaching applicable and inspiring for those which you're teaching, for those which are involved, what you have in mind. And that is Al Toimer La'adam Kablu Daiti. No one should say, just accept what I tell you. I'm telling you this about Mashiach. Don't think about it yourself. No, the Rebbe specifically wants that it should be taught in a way of Chochmah, Bina, and Das. Because only when someone understands it on their own, and they're not, the Mashiach that they're waiting for is not your Mashiach. The Mashiach that they're waiting for is their Mashiach. That is the way that we can bring about the Yisgalus of Melech HaMashiach. So Mirza Hashem will merit to the real time of the Dan Yechidi Ele Echad, and the Eibishter will take every single Yid, V'atam to look to Echad B'nai Yisrael, out of this Golos, and it should be Tekef Umiyad Mamish.